Hello, everyone. Thank you all again for joining us to Marketing Your Marketing Part 2. We'll do some quick intros on our end. So, I'm Brent Christelli. I am the Director of Sales here at Resi. And for some quick background on myself, I actually started my career on the operator side. So, I worked for a property management and development firm out of the Virginia Beach area, worked as a marketing manager and filled the seat of a marketing director for a bit there. Spent about 4 years or so there, and then transitioned to a digital marketing agency that served multifamily for around the same amount of time before I moved over to Resi last year. So this conversation is especially important to my heart. This is the conversation I would have absolutely loved to have heard when I sat on the operator side, and even when I was an account manager for the digital agency that I worked with. That really came down to speaking to those folks on the financial decision making side and really proving marketing's case from an ROI standpoint. So that's a quick background on myself. I'll turn it over to Sara and Sara for some intros.
Sure. Hi, I'm Sara Greeno. I'm the President and Chief Marketing Officer for Princeton Properties. We are based in Massachusetts. I spent many years in the marketing side of the company. I also oversee IT and property performance and have had a lot of conversations over the years with that kind of translating marketing efforts into operations execution. So to your point, Brent, it's a fun conversation. I'm looking forward to it today.
Hi, everybody. I'm Sara Graham. I am also based in the Boston area, and I am founder and CEO of a boutique consultancy called Six Dots. Prior to standing that up about 2 years ago, I was actually on the operator side, running marketing and customer experience across three different management companies. So I've been in the business for a very long time. I still work on the operator side as a fractional CMO, and I also consult on the supplier side. But this conversation, like Sara said, is also very near and dear to my heart. And where we are in the prime planning season for budgets, we thought this would be a really valuable conversation. So I'm excited to be here and to have this discussion with you all.
Like I mentioned, this is part two of Marketing Your Marketing. If you happen to attend our first version of Marketing Your Marketing a couple of weeks ago, that conversation was much more geared towards winning the room inside of your company. So today is far more around proving every marketing dollar's worth to a P&L statement. So what we often run into as marketers in multifamily is marketing's budget kind of gets siloed, but then it's also a bit of a catch-all at the same time. So the budget ultimately becomes a bit of a generic bucket, such as, does it go towards model furniture or a phone system or even fitness equipment for a new lease up, for all of that to land in. If marketing is under 5% of its budget, it's still the first line that everyone wants to ultimately cut within a P&L statement in order to maximize NOI. So when there's no accuracy in terms of what's being spent, marketing kind of earns that cost center label by default. Let me pop over to the slide. One big thing to hit on when it comes to this is your leadership team ultimately moves on terms and metrics such as leases, occupancy, and NOI. Those are really three big things that we're focused on that marketing ultimately generates and drives, not necessarily vanity metrics such as impressions and clicks. We as marketers know that impressions are an extremely important metric that has a good domino effect if we are increasing our impressions, increasing our clicks in a good way that's driving qualified traffic to our different marketing channels. That does have a positive impact down the funnel when it comes to those metrics further down. But when it comes to communicating that to your leadership teams, impressions and clicks don't necessarily resonate the way that it resonates with us as marketers. So Sara and Sara here are ultimately going to lay down the bridge. We're going to talk through four different moves in order, each really kind of or each aligning with our operator's language. We'll pop over. So when we talk about these four moves, we'll go through in order here, between the bridge of ROI to NOI. So number one is diagnosing before you defend. So finding out what's actually working and what's breaking within your marketing structure and your stack before you go and defend that number, and making sure that clean data is everyone's job. So making sure that the numbers that you're using across all of your different systems within marketing, leasing, operations give you that clean data so you can reliably report up to your leadership team and they trust that data. And then reporting even before they ask. This is a big one that I learned actually in my MBA program of proactively reporting up to leadership. So rather than fire drills happening when occupancy is starting to dip and you're getting that question of, what's going on in marketing? What are we doing here? You're proactively having those conversations with leadership. So you're earning that trust. And then the fourth pillar here of being honest what you can't prove goes back to earning that trust. We're all kind of, I feel like, obsessed with multi-touch attribution. That's just one thing that pops up into my head. That's definitely not a perfect system. So while we want to measure every little click, every little understanding of which prospect went to which channel, there's not necessarily like always metrics to be able to prove the specifics around that. So being honest about what you can't prove, if once you earn that trust up front, that really parlays directly into that. So now that we're moving into move one, which is diagnose before you defend, I'm sure everyone has probably heard this statement multiple times, even this week, of the we need more traffic. I wish I could count on one hand how many times that I've heard this statement, but I mean, goodness gracious, how many times I've heard that term, we need more traffic in that statement. And I'm sure everyone in this audience has received that exact sentence without it possibly never even being the real problem. So I'm going to turn it over to Sara to tell us a little bit more about the decommissioned leasing cell phone and tell us a little bit more about that story.
Sure. Yeah, I think this slide really says it all that, when someone is coming to you in the organization saying that they need more leads, it's important for the marketing team to really not immediately jump to that phrase literally. We need to just know that something is going wrong. There's a mismatch on the site, whether they're not, maybe they're not getting enough leads, but maybe they're not converting them to tours. Maybe there's something going on with the messaging that's online, or maybe there's even a technical problem. So we have to be a little bit more forensic when we're looking into that statement before we just immediately start lighting up new ad sources for people without thinking more about it. The example, Brent, you were alluding to is more recently this year, we had a property in our Boston core that was coming to our marketing department saying, we're not getting enough leads, we need more. Exactly that sentence, we need more leads. And before we just immediately started turning on new sources, I had my team, we started deep diving what's going on. We started running reports of lead volume, conversion rates into tours, conversion rates into apps and leases. We also started looking at all of the online presence to see if functionally everything is working. Are the call track numbers correct? Because nowadays there's so many layers of call track or email track that things break often with the feeds and the APIs. So we went out there and checked everything. Lo and behold, what we found was that they had a cell phone that they used during lease up that they decommissioned. And just it was back at the corporate office in a drawer of one of our operations managers, but no one ever unbundled that call source number that was tied to the cell phone. So that phone, that corporate office, had hundreds and hundreds of dead leads on it. And so it wasn't a we need more leads problem. It was a technical miss on our ops side that we didn't reroute phone numbers. So I think the kind of the takeaway there is that we do have to hear that stuff because we are the repository of when something's wrong, they want us to fix it. But it's not always as simple as just putting some new social ads on or just lighting up a new ILS.
Yeah, I think you raise a great point, Sara. And it's if you've been in this industry a minute, this sentence on this slide, it makes your hair stand up. You almost have a visceral reaction to it. It's like, oh, it's like every leasing call ever. The first thing out of someone's mouth is, we need more traffic. What's going on? But I think there's a really big sort of theme here where marketing is sort of the first thing that's pulled in and also the first place where the finger is pointed. And what you just outlined, Sara, is so important because without this diagnosis or being able to really do this forensic work, which I love that terminology, you're sort of just throwing dollars into a dumpster. You don't actually know that you do need definitively more traffic. And so I think this idea of playing detective or being able to dig in forensically um, is so important. And I know we've got a slide, I think, related to this, but there's sort of this idea of four Ps. And this is loosely related to the four Ps of marketing, where you've got people, product, promotion, and price. And, the people do the team, does the team on site really have the tools they need to succeed? Do they have the training? Do they have the right people on staff? Sometimes you've got people who are, maybe not perfectly aligned to what that property needs at that exact time, and you need a super closer, for example. And so sometimes there's a staffing shift to be made. With product, are your units actually made ready? And, or is there availability issues? With promotion, are the leads reaching the property? Maybe there's a phone in a drawer that nobody knows about. And price, is it right for the market right now? And so there are all of these different things to dig into before you automatically move to, does this property need more traffic? There could be 12 other things wrong. And marketers are really that connective tissue between operations and technology in many cases. We sit in that strategy seat and are architecting what the customer experience often looks and feels like. If you think about, we are setting up this vision for a property with photography and social media and managing our reputation appropriately. And that has to match reality when somebody actually gets on site. And so marketers are truly uniquely equipped to lead this forensic investigation. But I think there's so many other things to dig into before we all collectively agree that more traffic is the answer.
I'd love to turn it over to Sara Greeno to talk a little bit more about the forensic checklist. I absolutely loved that terminology of like looking at it as kind of a forensic investigation. So I'll turn it over to you, Sara, to talk a little bit more about this.
Yeah, Sarah's right on the money with the kind of four Ps that we do need to take a look at what our online presence is. As she articulated, we have all this web presence, we have a digital footprint, and by the time someone comes to our site, it's more of a validation tour. It's really to make sure that everything that they saw online is in fact accurate, that we're telling a perfect story. So part of the process is making sure all of our storytelling online has some continuity. It has continuity between the websites, the social sites, the ILSs, and then it is actually what's happening on the site. Are the units getting turned efficiently? Do they look good? Do they smell good? Are they done in a timely fashion? How many stale days are there between ready and move in? We shop our leasing agents and use those shopping reports for coaching. Are there coaching opportunities to retrain some of our team members? We'll look at the ILSs to make sure that some of the feeds haven't broken. Our 3D tours are still up and running. Anything like that. Verify that the phones are actually appropriately ported the right way. But then we'll loop in appropriate team members. If we're working in a third party situation, we're not going to immediately identify all these flaws and then go to the ownership and say, "Oh, our leasing agents are falling down. This is a catastrophe." We handle it internally. If I need to deploy a trainer or if I have a regional manager that I'll reach out to and say, "Hey, I noticed there's this particular leasing agent has a conversion rate that's a little bit lower than the other two going from lead to tour. Maybe there's something going on, or maybe that person needs a little bit more coaching on how to sell feature benefit or XYZ." And so we kind of look at it one off and dissect all those parts of it to see at what point is there a disconnect. Because it isn't just more volume to the site. It has to be really high quality volume. And then what is the team doing when they get it? And if we need to have some more training or, to Sara's point, even shake it up. And there certain leasing team members are better matched with certain property styles. And so maybe we just got to mix up the staff and put a better match there.
Yeah, I think the other piece of this too, I really appreciate what you said a moment ago about um, needing to loop in other resources. And I think marketing really plays an important role in this whole equation as a collaborative partner and resource. And you are pulling in people from other teams or other resources as appropriate. And it is never a one size fits all answer. This is uniquely scoped to a singular situation at a singular property always. We have tools in our toolbox, of course, but it is not a blanket answer to be able to solve this type of situation. And so I think when we think like that, we become a resource instead of a scapegoat. And our operations teams and our leadership teams and our even technology teams or other resources, training, et cetera, start to see us much more as a resource instead of the fall guy, to say, hey, this is the first thing that is going to get cut. We become much more adequately and appropriately positioned as a true resource for teams. And so that helps to cement, I think, the thinking and strategy and, again, toolboxes that we bring to the table when things get sticky at a property.
Sarah, you're right. The resource part of it, I think, is the capital capital
Mhm.
lettered word there. I know for me, I call every management team on Tuesdays with a colleague of mine, and we position ourselves as we're the customer service for the site teams. What can we do to help you? And on those Tuesday calls, we talk about what happened last week, the leasing velocity, the marketing efforts, anything that seems a little bit off. And then we also meet once a month with department heads throughout the company to talk about the whole effort of the brand. And we again position ourselves as the marketing department we're the ones that just let us know how we can help, regardless of what department, because it is all totally intertwined. And that we have to be the more data in that they give us, the more that we can help them. If they keep communication with us, then we can really figure out what is the problem. Um, I had a property that they weren't getting a lot of traffic recently, and come to find out there was some street demo that happened on the road. They took down our entire monument sign. They took down the whole front wall. Everything is gone. But that wasn't conveyed to us here in this town, and they're just complaining that there wasn't enough action with drive-by or energy out in front of the property. Come to find out, we didn't even have a front entrance.
I
Great
think that,
reason to ask lots of questions.
Yes, yes, ask. I was like,
yes.
well, we got to go back
Yeah.
to the town. They should give us a little heads up when they do stuff like that.
Yes.
I think that's such an important piece of marketing's job is it's almost like leasing enablement in a way. You just position yourself as, how can you best support the leasing team in order to help them achieve their goals? You're not necessarily coming in to scrutinize, because a lot of times marketing can get scrutinized, and then we start to look at our leasing teams like, well, why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? But like to understand the ins and outs of what's happening on the property, being that kind of leasing enablement and positioning yourself as a true resource for your leasing team is really where marketing can maximize their presence within the organization and ultimately like help everyone achieve that goal. So, and then what I love about this forensic checklist, and I think you had mentioned about like not having a blanket answer to things. A lot of times the blanket answer is we're just going to increase PPC traffic or PPC budget, or we're going to like, go the higher ILS package. And this kind of forensic run through into what's happening at the property is so important in order to be able to diagnose specifically what's going on. And then having that answer, not just from a marketing traffic standpoint and communicating your metrics, but then communicating in leases, tours. What is your lead to tour rate? What's your tour to conversion rate in terms of applications? Like those are the pieces that you need to understand as a marketer in order to be able to effectively deploy new and updated strategies in terms of updating and changing occupancy.
Right, you
So
mentioned the packages of
yeah,
ILSs, and is one other thing that's really important to lean on your partners, because it isn't as simple as, you know, should I up my package? They're like, oh, well, you'll get
yeah,
more impressions, but you should have the real comfort to challenge them of show me regional data, show me how I'm comparing against my comps, show me my exact small little square in the world. And sometimes, even if you did move up a package, it wouldn't impact you because your comp set is a different set. Maybe they're lower than you. Maybe it wouldn't matter. You could be using a bullhorn from a roof and no one's listening. So you can really lean on them for very specific granular data before you make those decisions.
so important. It's absolutely so important. Every market is different. Every property is different. The comps are going up against each property deserves its own unique tailored strategy. And it's so important to not just have that blanketed approach across the board. So we'll continue to transition into move two here. So when we talk about the overall, like we had talked a little bit about like the importance of clean data. So ultimately your diagnosis as well from a forensic lens is ultimately like as good as the data underneath it. So I'm really curious across our audience here is like, can you trust your data today? Super curious to hear what that kind of looks like. But we'll go ahead and transition here, and I'll give this over to Sara Graham to talk a little bit more about the importance of clean data and garbage in and garbage out.
Yeah, I have seen this from so many different perspectives. Saw it in house, now I see it as a fractional. Um, Everybody is touching the data, and it truly is a garbage in, garbage out scenario where most of us cannot just unilaterally decide to rip out Yardi or Entrata or whatever your PMS is. You can't just rip that out. And so you have to be able to work with what you've got. And again, this is a lot about asking the right questions to say, where is the data coming from? Where does it fall apart? Can we trust it? And if not, why not? And so a lot of this ties back to what the on-site teams are doing day in and day out in your PMS of choice. And some of this is hard coded. If your stack is set up as such where leads flowing in from your ILS partners or your pay-per-click campaigns or what have you, there's all kinds of um, useful tech with dynamic number insertion and switch codes and all kinds of things that actually do hard code your data. But we all know that teams get walk-ins too, and there are things that do have to manually be entered into your system, even if only occasionally. And again, depending on how robust your tech stack is, you might be having to do a lot more manual entry than some of your comps. And so the timeliness of the data, the accuracy of that data really matters. And if that data doesn't exist, your on-site teams are, everything builds up from there on a very shaky foundation. And so that is really a critical thing to think about and make sure that your on-site teams really understand the why behind that. But you also, I think we all need to remember that truly perfect data is not a thing. As much as we want it to be, it's just not. And so that gets really complicated sometimes. But I think there's, some valuable pieces here to lean on in that, again, whatever data your teams are putting in, that carries forward as entered. And some of the CRMs that are out there still do operate much more on a single touch attribution rather than a multi-touch attribution. And so that too can get a little bit murky. But again, this is really sort of the foundation of what most of us as marketers have to rely on. And it does actually inform a lot of pretty major decisions about what gets into a budget, what's getting renewed, what's getting cut. We're collectively relying on that data that is entered on site and using that to help inform decisions all the way up to portfolio level decisions where there are some pretty major stakes. And so I think there's a lot of reliance out of necessity on what actually happens with data. And this is, again, the everyday data that your teams are touching. And so I think sometimes we oversimplify or truly, don't give enough credit to what's happening on the on-site level from a data standpoint.
Yeah, I agree with you, Sarah. I think part of it is that we need to get real comfortable as marketers that there is a little bit of slippage and a little bit of inaccuracy in the data, that we do have to sit in a place that is okay. And we have to make decisions based a little bit on gut or what we think we know also with the data. So there's a little bit of that going on to start, but then the more you nailed it, the more that we give the site teams the why is this important for accuracy, that they'll get it. I know earlier this week I was working with a team that I was reviewing all their closing notes in the system just to see the leads that didn't convert. What was wrong? Were we mismatched with pet policies? Were we mismatched with sizing of units that are currently available? But as I was digging in, there was a very large percentage of the closed leads called archived. I'm like, well, what does that mean? That doesn't help me make any decisions. And the team just really didn't know that that would be a place that we would look to make decisions. It was that we needed to do a better job at the corporate level, giving them the why. Why would we want closing note information really granular? Oh, that makes a lot of sense now because we have that nimbleness to change our, say our ad copy to advertise a different size property, apartment if, say we're heavy on one beds or heavy on twos or whatever it might be. Um, so that the constant communication with the site teams of why we would want to know this stuff is really important. I see that you popped up the screen with the word of mouth story. I'll share one more silly story that I was years ago before we had the luxury of so much of this tied to feeds. So we do have a lot of the information of how people hear about us automatically put into our CRMs. But years ago, it was a much more manual process. And I had a group of properties that the teams there were really coding the majority of all their leads to word of mouth. And now it's sort of urban legend here at the company that you can't submit a piece of paper to me with a WOM on it because I'm going to throw it out. They just know it can't happen with me. Um, and I was getting all of these WOMs coming into the office. And I was like, oh my God, we should be so lucky that we're like Nike or Pepsi, or we're so popular that everyone is running up and down the streets talking about Princeton. We're the belle of the ball around here. I said, I wish we were that popular. And so I said, well, let's challenge this to the team. I said, okay, I guess we don't need any ILS ads. I guess we don't need a website. I guess we don't need that monument sign out front. Let's just pull it all down. Because obviously we don't need any of this. And you could see their faces change of like, well, oh, well, maybe we do need, and it really got people thinking. Obviously, that was a very dramatic way to get the point across, but it got them thinking that, oh gosh, I'm connecting that dots that why the accuracy of that information is important because if Sara takes away all the sources, I don't think there is a parade outside just coming in with their WOMs.
Yeah, I love that story so much, Sarah, and I think it's a great example, like a true real life example of, oh, wait a minute, what we actually put into this system matters. I think there's another big one too, in that a lot of the data that teams are entering, they actually get bonused on that.
Mm,
And so, back to the why that you raised, a lot of management companies that I've worked in and now with, they're incentivizing teams based on, either leases closed or renewals. And so there's a real financial incentive to say, we've got to put our money where our mouth is, so to speak. And if it's not in the system, they're not getting credit for it. So there's a really compelling reason, not just on the, hey, what you say helps us make renewal decisions or decisions about sources to amp up or cut back, but there's money in their pocket too that this garbage in, garbage out model can potentially influence as well. So I think accuracy is really in their best interest, and saying that out loud to our teams, I think can go a long way, whether it is plainly said as that or as a, hey, by the way, I guess we can just, scrap every dollar of marketing we've ever done. Lots of ways to share that message, but I think it's important that teams get what's in it for them too.
good point.
Absolutely. Speaking of which, about putting money
Yeah.
behind these incentives.
Yeah, for sure. I think the other thing I'll sort of extend that thinking about a little bit is um, not every financial incentive or financially driven decision or conversation has to be something that requires a permanent budget change. I think there's a lot to be said for testing and iterating and even running campaigns internally. I'm working with a client currently. We have a social media incentive campaign going right now. And so there's some really clear metrics about, we're looking for the teams to increase um, the cadence of their posting on social media, but also to enhance the quality. And so we've architected a mini campaign that's running for a couple of months. And we've got scorecards and really clear ideas about what great looks like. And if they are able to hit certain metrics, that's dollars in their pocket. So again, not just lease renewals or new leases, but some other ways to think about building out the sense of community online. And that actually does drive leasing activity. Maybe not as directly as let's, increase the spend on a pay-per-click campaign by $2,000 for the next 60 days. But there is, a true, I think, use case for enhancing all areas of an online presence, and social is certainly a big part of that. We all know that AI search agents, I saw some questions from Paul in the chat, and I'm excited to tackle those in a little bit. But AI is crawling social. And so there's benefit there too to make sure that the property is truly fully represented. But I think the idea of this is really to be able to keep things seasonal or keep them constrained. It can be 6 or 8 weeks. We used to run leasing contests at a company that I used to work for where we would actually have a really sort of a hustle, a collective hustle to get as much activity as we could in 6 or 8 weeks. And the contest was structured so that even a property that was 96, 97%, they could still potentially win, even if they were competing against a lease up that had hundreds of units to move. So I think just encouraging some healthy competition is a really good thing. And the idea of being able to report it out and just share the wins collectively helps to really enhance this idea of a team effort, but there are a lot of ways to influence NOI, even with some pretty small moves, or what seemingly small moves. And again, to be able to do that in bursts and not have to make permanent budget changes can make that really attractive to your leadership team if you're trying to figure out how do we, get from point A to point B.
Yeah, and I think we also occasionally, if we just don't have any dollars in the bucket, we
Mm.
use praise, public praise, and instead of any kind of financial impact that we have. For example, we have a Friday social roundup that we'll use on our intranets, and our marketing director will push out 4 or 5 of the social posts. All the teams are responsible for their own social posting, and she'll post out some of the highlights for the week and why. And senior leadership will be weighing in so that they know that there's eyeballs on their efforts and they're getting the attention to what we're prioritizing, and they're getting that public praise too. And we've found that that's a very successful tool to really encourage what we need from the teams and also give them that well-deserved praise too, that they are doing great work. And it's really nice to have it in a shared environment that we can all see it together.
Yeah, you had also, Sarah, I think during our prep session, mentioned this idea going back to the whole collaborative piece of this conversation where not all great marketing ideas start with marketing, right?
Yes, good point. I think we were talking about the ops team. They're trying to incentivize cross-selling,
Mhm.
and a lot of the we had a group of properties that, we try to really spread our marketing dollars throughout because we have a really dense footprint in this area, and there are 5 or 6 like kind assets all in the area. So we really encourage the site teams in those properties to cross-sell a lot. And they were challenged with how can we get them to better cross-sell rather than us just lighting up more ad sources for each of those individual
Mm.
sites, which are they're so like kind. We should be able to get enough and cross-sell. So the ops team were like, let's double our cross-sell bonuses and we'll put them in the commission structures for the monthly payouts to our leasing teams. And that spread our marketing dollars better because now people are cross-selling each other. We don't have to have individual ads per asset. And because of the ops team having that need to figure out how to better sell and do an initiative internally. So yeah, Sarah, you're right that it's really important to listen to the ops, the finance, listen to all the departments, what their challenges are, have real collaboration. I think that's something that the marketing team, we're almost like in-house therapists in some respects, that we do need to spend to have these deep conversations, be inquisitive. That's always put me in good stead my whole career, is I've been very interested in the organization as a whole. What are you working on? What's going on in your area? And it's very interesting just to get that from, the people that are putting on a roof next door. Like, how is that working? What is happening over there? And um, if we're inquisitive, there's a way for marketing to help. There always seems to be a way for us to insert ourselves, or to have more knowledge to be more accurate about our brand. When we're really deep diving into all the different departments in the company, we have a more holistic look at what our brand is, and we can better advertise ourselves, I feel.
I love the cross-selling incentive piece because once you've proven that that works really well across leasing teams, that also allows you as a marketer to prove, what kind of campaigns you want to run across multiple communities and proving the case for like, hey, we want to run this regional landing page where we have multiple properties within the same area that it makes sense to do cross-selling because they have, similar rents or similar units and features. And if one property doesn't have availability or has low availability, doesn't have exactly what your prospect is looking for, that can easily be an opportunity to point that prospect to a different property. So being able to like prove the case with just the clean data and, working with those on-site teams to build an initial case for a new marketing campaign you might want to run will also hold a lot of weight as you bring those campaigns, those ideas to leadership in order to kind of influence that spend. So we're going to pop over to move three now. So clean numbers nobody sees ultimately are nothing. So when we talk about like who's telling the story here and how move three is about reporting, and proactively doing so. And what we're going to talk about are kind of two artifacts, which would be the one pager as well as the annual plan. So I'll turn it over to Sara Greeno to talk a little bit more about the one pager.
Sure. Um, Very early in my marketing career, I was in charge of, at the time, it was called digital marketing. They really separated real marketing and digital marketing when I was first a marketing director here. And I was creating websites, and I was doing some of our online advertising, and that was an emergent field. Who I worked for, I was realizing they're not even really knowing what to ask me. I don't know how I can benchmark my success to them because they're not going to ask the right questions. So what I did at the time is I created a one pager. I created something that showed all of the websites that I was taking care of, month over month behavior, year over year behavior. I was also tying it, what I think this is the critical part, I was tying all of that action, the impressions and the clicks on the websites, I was tying it directly to leases on the apartment communities that I was advertising. So I'd list out the top 5 sources that would bring applications to a site and the top 5 sources that would bring leases to a site. And if they were different, I'd have a narrative. I'd talk a little bit about why I thought that. And I would create this and I submitted it to the 5 or 6 people I was working up to once a month. Half of the document, they weren't really even sure the language on it or what it was, but it did 2 things. That consistency, it gave them a level of comfort that I was on it, whatever on it meant, that I was on the case. And then it also opened up the door for dialogue. It let them come ask me about something. When they'd notice, I would use very specific a green arrow up when things were moving up and a red arrow down when things were going down, really interesting visual cues. And it would have them come in and want to talk to it. So I became a resource. I became something that they would want to come in and speak to. And I gave it to different department heads. So I would recommend anyone middle in their career or middle upper in their career to just always report up, even if they're not asking. Make some information that you deem important put it on something very digestible, and then just hand it out or email it out the cadence doesn't have to be weekly. It can be monthly or quarterly, just so they see that you are a trusted, eyes on the prize person. And that gives them something that they can trust you too, so that when you are then moving forward in your career, needing to make big swings that you can't quite prove, because as we said earlier in today's conversation, we can't always prove all the numbers in marketing. Sometimes there's a level of faith and trust in the decision maker. If you're setting up the groundwork with reporting on the regular, they will have a little bit more confidence, optimistically, and faith that you're doing what's best for the brand and what's best for the company.
Yeah, I think the idea of being proactive rather than reactive is so important on this front. I think there are often a lot of us that do report to people that may not have a full grasp of what marketing is actually doing, whether that's day to day, week to week, sort of generally, even our immediate supervisors. Um, who are incredibly talented, smart people don't always have the foundation of marketing. And so I think there is this sort of idea of educating up and across, and reporting is a great way to do that. One of the things that I did and now often suggest that my clients do is if they don't do a monthly plan or a quarterly check-in, at the very least, sort of, broad base, a great place to start can be an annual plan where you are actually talking about what we said we would do and what would actually happen, and then what we propose next year and why. And so, year over year, if you're sort of repurposing this strategic plan framework, it becomes really intentional and you create a huge amount of visibility and transparency, which, as you said, Sarah, goes a long way to building that trust factor. Um, you then can start to make the asks for resources, whether that is you need to pull in people from other teams or additional budget for things. And then building into how you're going to measure that. So the framework can be something that can be used repeatedly and goes 85% of what you did, if that happened in 2026, what you're asking for in 2027 is you've got that foundation of trust. And so people are more likely to say, okay, there's clear strategy here and this is well thought out and the resources that are being asked for make sense compared to the size of the ask. And what's the strategy that's really being mapped out here. And so that concept is how I grew from a one-woman show multiple times to build out a team over time. When I was in house, I started as a one-person department multiple times, and this type of framework is what helped me eventually be able to grow the team and the capacity of the department. And over time, the idea of marketing as an in-house agency where the on-site teams were our actual clients, that model really resonated with a lot of the people that were in the executive positions when I was a manager or director, and it helped to really create a sense of value. So we're going from this idea of, again, marketing as cost center to marketing as strategy and growth driver. So I think that's a really important shift as you're thinking about how to position some of the work, whether you are putting together weekly, quarterly, or some kind of yearly framework and reporting. The only thing I wanted to highlight here is just, again, as marketers are thinking about the transparency factor, as you are architecting systems, campaigns, whatever it may be, making sure that your regionals and site teams know what you're doing and why, and have some baseline of performance data. They are often the first people who are, they're probably in weekly meetings with owners or, the head of the management company, what have you, depending on how you're structured. We want to make sure, again, if we're positioning marketing as this partner and resource for our teams, we want to make sure that they have some baseline data they can report on so that they can answer those questions with confidence. It's team effort, and I think making sure that data, is transmitted back out to the organization as you're starting to see that performance data come in is incredibly important.
Yeah, I agree, Sarah. The report up and also the report out, as you
Yes.
articulated, is really important.
It's incredibly important. And we'll transition to move four, which is probably maybe the most difficult thing to prove internally of areas where you might not necessarily have the data or there's, kind of being honest about what you can't prove and how to navigate that conversation. So that really starts with the fact that, ultimately not everything is measurable. So I'm going to turn over to Sara Graham to talk a little bit more about this piece.
Yeah, I feel like we've touched on this a little bit just throughout the course of this conversation, but I think there are things
Mhm.
that are really hard to quantify. There's plenty that we can, and goodness knows we all have mountains of data. Sometimes the question is, what do we do with it? But there are some things in marketing that are really hard to measure, whether that's brand initiatives or things that are we can quantify some aspects of SEO and reputation, but the sort of um, threads through to direct performance and leasing performance are not always, black and white. There's a lot of shades of gray when we're looking at some of this data. But I think being really upfront about what you can share for data points and what you can't, again, goes a long way to building that trust. And I think that builds over time, where Sarah said earlier, we can't just say, trust me. That has to be earned, and you cannot just roll in hot and say, yeah, I've got this thing. It comes off as very pushy and salesy in the worst of ways, and it does the opposite. It works against everything that we've been talking about architecting over the last 45 minutes or so.
Yeah, and I think this goes back to that controlling the narrative too,
Mm.
that if we are being open and honest of what we can measure, what we cannot, why it matters, why it doesn't matter, we become a trusted partner. And when we are very communicative with the other departments in the organization, we keep building that level of trust and openness. And then you get to that point. I think I was joking on one of our prep calls that you think of us as like a chef. Nobody asks you all the ingredients in the beautiful soup that you're eating. They just know that it's really good. So at some point, they have to not worry about all the little ingredients that went into it. Just know that we're going to make something that is awesome. And but we have to get to that point with regular reporting, regular communication, regular small wins and small proof of concept so that they will trust us on certain areas that we can't one for one prove. Because a lot of marketing is not a one for one that we can say this exact thing caused this exact amount of leases. It's not the way the business works. So we have to just be real communicative about that fact that it is. I always equate it to like a basketball strategy that you have to take up more room under the hoop because
Mm.
there's an awful lot of I ask people to put the Craigslist ads on and the Google Business Profile ads, and all of this is just taking up more real estate online. We're just taking up more online, and none of that is a one for one, but it's a whole groundswell. And so we need to just continue to communicate that effort and measure what we can. Um, and then optimistically, they'll have that leap of faith with us when we get to that point when we have to do something that we know is best for the brand. We just can't put our finger exactly on it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think you're right, Sarah. And I would say, the end goal of this is not just trust, but autonomy.
Mm.
Where all of this building of trust allows marketers to do more with faster buy-in. And I think it's also, paving the way for different kinds of marketers to show up in our industry. You're president and chief marketing officer. That is not something that existed in our industry 20 years ago. And I would say for myself, I'm a fractional CMO. Also not something that really existed 20 years ago. So the idea of marketing showing up in this collaborative way is really, I think, opening a lot more doors for marketers to have even more impactful roles in all of the work that we're doing collectively as an industry.
Yes.
100%. And I think that with our last 5 minutes, I'm so excited to ask this question and hear both of your takes on this. When it comes to winning budget without data, for hard cases such as like, justifying the need for a website refresh or getting new lifestyle photography, if you wanted to run a new social campaign or video, like all those things cost real marketing dollars and they're not cheap by any means. So with those asks that have no data behind them, how do you win those internally?
Yeah, a lot on the screen now is right on the money. It's not about I don't know, it just feels old, or it's not it's not the most modern colors or look and feel. It's really about functionality. What's going to win a budgeting dollar is if we are slowing down, if our websites aren't performing as well as our competition, if we can do a little bit of research in advance, look at the area comps, look at some award-winning websites, show them if we are functionally obsolete. There are plenty of websites that show page load speeds or that show what your effectiveness is to, as Sara articulated earlier with the AI they're reading our websites, they're reading our social posts. So there's also scoring for that, how we're scoring for SEO, GEO, AEO. So those kind of structural problems, if you want a new website, that's what's going to win the conversation to get more money to get a refresh.
Yeah, and I would just layer in, I think bringing the customer experience into this conversation is really valuable, as Sara said, understanding how you show up in search, how you show up in AI search. That's where a lot of our renters are finding our communities. And so understanding what that journey looks like can often help influence potential resource reallocation if needed, even if it feels like there is no budget. Sometimes there are things that can be done quickly and or inexpensively when you're able to make the case that the game has changed.
And I think this is such a good segue to kind of like wrap up and talk about that bridge between, ROI and NOI. When it's like every move that we discuss between diagnosing before you defend, making clean data everyone's job, reporting before they ask, leads to the last pillar here of being honest what you can't prove. You've built up that trust. You've done your kind of investigative journalism and collaboration and leasing enablement with the teams to understand what is going on and uncovering gaps, areas of improvement within your marketing structure and your strategy to ultimately prove the case to leadership and make that case for why you need a new website or why you should actually spend less on this ILS provider and more on PPC or invest more effort into Google Business Profile and reputation, what have you. All of that kind of culminates into this. So thank you to both Sara Greeno and Sara Graham for the time today. Thank you all for taking the time to join us. The recording of this webinar, as well as the toolkit from this webinar, will be in your inbox within the week. So we really appreciate everyone's time today, and thank you all so much for joining us.